The train hissed like an exhausted animal as it slowed to a stop at the edge of nowhere. And Clara. Whitmore stepped down onto the wooden platform clutching a single worn suitcase, her heart pounding harder than the iron wheels that had carried her across half the country, because this was it, this desolate stretch of land in Montana. Territory was supposed to be her new life, her new beginning, her salvation, yet the wind cut through her thin coat and whispered doubts into her ears as she scanned the empty platform until her eyes finally found him, standing apart from the others like a man carved from the land itself. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face hardened by sun and silence, Ethan Callahan, the rancher who had answered her letter, the man she had agreed to marry without ever hearing his voice. And when their eyes met, there was no smile, no warmth, only a measured nod, as if she were another delivery he hadn't asked for but was obligated to accept. The ride to the ranch passed in uneasy silence, broken only by the creak of the wagon and the distant cry of hawks, Clara trying to gather courage while Ethan seemed to retreat further into himself with every mile. And by the time the ranch house came into view, a sturdy structure, perched against endless fields and a looming sky already heavy with dusk, Clara's hands were trembling not from cold but from the realization that she was utterly alone here, dependent on a stranger's mercy. And when she stepped down from the wagon again and followed him up the porch steps, hope flickered briefly in her chest, but it was extinguished the moment Ethan stopped at the door, turned to face her and said in a voice rough as gravel, "You'll not be staying inside tonight," causing her breath to catch as humiliation burned her cheeks and she whispered, "I can sleep in the barn," the words tumbling out like a plea she hated herself for making, because she had crossed states, endured hunger and buried grief to get here, only to beg for shelter like a beggar. And yet Ethan's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening as he shook his head and said flatly, "No," before unlocking the house, stepping inside alone, and closing the door behind him with a finality that echoed louder than the slam itself, leaving Clara standing on the porch as night crept in and fear coiled around her heart. She didn't cry, not then, because survival had taught her tears were a luxury, and so she gathered what dignity she had left and made her way to the barn, where the smell of hay and animals was sharp but familiar, reminding her painfully of the farm she'd lost back east. And as she settled onto a thin bed of straw, wrapping herself in her coat, she wondered what kind of man would answer a bride's letter yet refuse her warmth, and what kind of fate had led her into the orbit of someone so guarded, unaware that inside the house, Ethan stood rigid by the window watching her small figure disappear into the darkness, his chest aching with memories he had sworn never to reopen, memories of a wife buried 2 winters ago, of promises broken by illness and God alike, of a house that had once been full of laughter and was now a hollow shell he refused to let another woman fill, not because he hated Clara, but because he feared that letting her in, literally and figuratively, would break the fragile walls he had built around his grief. And as the lantern burned low and the prairie wind howled, 2 wounded souls lay awake under the same sky, neither knowing that this night of rejection would become the first thread in a story of endurance, transformation, and love hard won. And if you feel the weight of Clara's fear and Ethan's pain already pulling at your heart, stay with this story, because what comes next will change everything. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the moments where broken beginnings turn into unforgettable journeys. Morning arrived pale and cold, and Clara awoke stiff and aching, her breath fogging the air as she sat up in the barn, brushing straw from her hair and reminding herself that she had survived worse than a single night of rejection, because survival had always been her quiet talent. Yet when she stepped outside and saw the house bathed in early light, something inside her hardened, not into bitterness, but resolve, and instead of waiting for permission, she began helping, feeding chickens, mending a loose fence with hands already blistered from past lives of labor. And Ethan noticed, though he pretended not to, watching from a distance as she moved with purpose, never complaining, never accusing, and something about that unsettled him more than anger ever could, because it mirrored the strength his late wife had once carried, a strength that had both sustained and shattered him. And days passed like this, Clara sleeping in the barn despite the cold, refusing to ask again, while Ethan kept the house locked at night as if guarding himself from ghosts. Yet the land itself seemed to conspire against his resolve, Because storms came, livestock fell ill, and one night Clara worked through rain and thunder to save a newborn calf while Ethan watched helplessly from the porch, struck by the realization that this woman, this stranger, had already begun to belong to the ranch in ways he could not deny, and when she collapsed from exhaustion afterward, feverish and shaking, something inside him finally broke, fear overriding pride as he carried her into the house without thinking, laying her in the very bed he had forbidden her from, pacing the floor as memories surged and guilt crushed his chest, because locking her out had never been about cruelty but control, and now control had nearly cost him her life. Clara woke to warmth and lamplight, confused but alive, and when she met Ethan's eyes there was no triumph in hers, only quiet understanding, as if she had always known he was fighting something far larger than her presence. And in that silence words were unnecessary, because healing often begins not with apologies but with actions. And from that night forward the house remained unlocked, though neither spoke of it, and slowly, painstakingly, they began learning each other, not as mail-order fantasies, but as flawed, grieving, resilient humans sharing meals, shared labor, shared stories whispered by firelight, Clara revealing the losses that had driven her west, Ethan finally confessing the fear that loving again would dishonor what he had lost. And in time they discovered that love is not a replacement, but an expansion, that the heart can hold grief and hope at once, and when spring came and the land bloomed, so did something between them, something earned through hardship and patience. And on the day Ethan finally handed Clara the house key without ceremony, she smiled not because she needed it anymore, but because it symbolized trust freely given, and as their story became one of partnership rather than survival, the ranch thrived, not because the past was erased, but because it was honored and carried forward together. And if this story of resilience, redemption, and slow-burning love moved you even a little, remember that many more powerful stories like this await you here. So subscribe to the channel, stay with us, and keep believing that even the coldest locked doors can open to warmth when courage and compassion finally meet.